Hey there, my name is Miranda, 3D artist from Denver, Colorado, and in today's presentation, I'm going to be showing you my personal process on how I make horror characters using ZBrush, Substance Painter, and Cinema 4D. So before we get started, a little bit of background on myself. I've been a freelancer for 5 years, and before going freelance, I was actually the 3D artist for the Denver Broncos back when they won the Super Bowl. My work was actually shown at the Super Bowl, and I also got a ring for being an employee. Since going freelance, I've had the opportunity to work with amazing studios and clients like The Mill, the NFL, Crypt TV, and even worked with Beeple. So, as is customary with these presentations, let's go ahead and check out my reel, and then afterwards I'll show you what we're going to be making. Hopefully you like the reel. As you can see, I'm a huge fan of making things that are scary. Alright, so today what we're going to be learning is how to make this Jason mask from Friday the 13th. So what you're seeing is the finished product. As you can see, there's a lot of cool detail on this mask. So while I'll be showing you how to make a pretty simple model in this presentation, this process can actually be expanded to a much more complex character. So as an example, here's a video with Michael Myers from Halloween. It's a fun process that's actually allowed me to explore my creativity in the horror realm. So anyways, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so we're inside of ZBrush here, and so as soon as you open it, you get greeted by this menu here. And this is your lightbox, which is the closest thing you're going to find to a content browser inside of ZBrush. And so, yeah, it comes in with pre-built with a lot of things, preloaded, I should say, and lots of cool stuff. But for the particular example I'm going to be showing you, you don't really need to dive into any of these, although I do recommend you do check it out for yourself. The ones that we're going to be using is either this demo head, the female, or the male. In this particular case, I'm going to use the male version, and it has male proportions. So let's go ahead and open this guy. It'll ask you if you want to change it, just say no. It'll open up the demo head, and you have access to it. So before I kind of get into the navigation of ZBrush and how it works, I kind of want to address a little thing. I kind of feel like some people are probably going to be thinking to themselves like, hey, doesn't Cinema 4D have like its own sculpting module? And you're not wrong. It does have sculpting tools. So if you go into your sculpting layout, it gives you this option, which lets you subdivide, all that stuff that you would find in ZBrush, but it also has these brushes. And so like the most obvious one is grab, where you can like grab it and pull. And obviously you also have like this pulling one, which kind of fills up like the layer underneath and kind of pulls it forward. And this whole thing is very similar to ZBrush in certain ways, but I just kind of want to show why I would emphasize using ZBrush over this particular thing. And that's because when we go inside of ZBrush and I hit the B button, you can see that there is quite a bit more brushes here. And these ones all do extremely different things. From, just like doing the stuff that you saw, like moving, kind of adding volume and stuff. But it also has the ability to do these things called IMM, which lets you load in models. It also has fabric, so you can actually like simulate fabric and stuff. There's a lot of really cool stuff in here that I don't necessarily think Cinema 4D is going to be able to replicate one-to-one. And also some of these tools are extremely powerful, especially when you're using them in horror. So yeah, so I would just say try giving ZBrush a chance in this regard, simply because of the amount of brushes that you can work with and the different abilities that each one gives you. Cool. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and start talking about the navigation. So ZBrush has an interesting way of navigating. It's a little esoteric compared to other 3D programs. And so when I say esoteric, it's like there are certain industry standards, and ZBrush doesn't quite adhere to them. It's kind of like the industry standard for sculpting, but when it comes to just traditional 3D navigation, it doesn't really follow those rules. So most people should be familiar with the alt-click method. You hit alt-click, or you hit alt, and then when you click, it lets you rotate around something. But here, if I hit alt-click and then start moving, it goes left and right. And in order to actually orbit around something, I have to click outside of my model. But there is a better way of navigating, I think, which is called the right-click method. So instead of using Alt as your base button, it's your right-click. And so I'm using a Wacom tablet. I have my my right-click set to this guy right here, the bottom one. So it's very easy to get to. And what you can do with that is that you can right-click on your model and then move it around, and it'll let you orbit. If you were to just click and drag, it starts sculpting. So it's a nice way to tell it to navigate rather than sculpt. And when you use it in conjunction with Alt and Control, I'm using PC, so if I say Control, just know that I'm meaning Command. But when you hit Alt and then right-click, it lets you do the up and down, left and right. And then if you use Control, it'll let you push in and out. And so in conjunction with all of this stuff, you can navigate it pretty easily. And if you hold down Shift, it'll actually give you the ability to snap to the orthographic views. This is super useful, especially if you're using reference imagery, which uses orthographic views. But yeah, on top of that, each button itself has its sort of multiple functions. So when you're sculpting, so let's get closer, and I start sculpting here, it pulls it outwards, which is called Z add. And you can see it up here. And you can actually do a Z subtract, which will push it inwards instead of outwards. And so when you hit Alt and then start sculpting, it does the opposite. Cool. And so now if you do that again, but with the Control button, it'll then create a mask. And this will protect it from being manipulated by the brushes, sorry. And so you can clear it by just holding that Control and then dragging outside of the model, and it'll remove the mask. Cool. And if you want to set it to be Z subtract as your default, you can just hit this button up here and it'll switch it over. And so now it'll push it in, and Alt will just switch it over to add. Cool. So that's kind of more or less how you navigate. There's obviously other interesting little techniques that you can use. So if I want to switch from one model to the next, you can actually hold down Alt and then just tap once, and it'll switch over to the other model, and it'll darken the other models but brighten the one that you're using. So now it's on the eyes, so I can actually start sculpting on the eyes, and it looks really weird. Cool. So then if I use Alt and I tap on the head, it'll switch over to that thing. Cool. So let's go ahead and talk about brushes. So as mentioned earlier, when you press B, you have all of this really cool stuff. The thing that you start out with is called your standard brush, which basically kind of works like the pool inside of Cinema 4D. And it kind of just creates there's a sphere underneath the surface, which is kind of pulling things out in a rounded way, which is nice. But there's a lot of really cool tools. In particular, my favorite one is the Move tool. So the way you navigate the brushes, instead of having to find each one yourself, you can actually just type in M, which will then filter down to all of the brushes that start with M. And I know from just using it that V is the button for the Move tool. And so you switch it over, and now when I start pulling, it starts manipulating the mesh in a very sort of like smeary sort of way. And what I like about this particular system of switching brushes is that it's almost like you're spelling out a word. So if I hit B and then M, and it's almost like I'm spelling move, M-O-V, and then, yeah, but I'm skipping the O. So once you kind of get used to that sort of thing, you can kind of type out certain words. So like if I want to use a standard brush, I hit B, then S, and then T for standard. And so you kind of eventually start realizing which series of buttons you need to press to get them to work. But yeah, once you kind of have those memorized, it's very easy to just switch over. You can also apply them up here, which will kind of give you a quick selection. So one brush that I'm going to be using a little bit later, which I really enjoy, it's actually like it's my go-to when it comes to creating horror characters, and it's called the blob tool. So if you hit B and then B again, and then L, you can then see what it does. And it kind of creates like this weird sort of blobby effect, which is really fun. And also if you do negative, it kind of pushes inwards. But what's really cool about the blob tool in particular is that you can do this thing over here where you load an alpha. So it's a black and white image, which then kind of changes the profile of your brush. So if I were to choose something like, I don't know, let's grab like a fractured, like these lines. And if I get close and I start dragging it, you can see that it kind of has that sort of profile. And so eventually we'll be using it with Sculptris. I need to get to that first before I show you, but just keep in mind that alphas are things that you can definitely do. And you could even create your own, like just using Photoshop or whatever, just doing a black and white image with a certain shape, and then you can just load it straight in. Cool. So let's go ahead and switch over to standard. And I want to show you what's going on over here on this right side. So the closest thing that you can find to a object manager in ZBrush is this thing called the Subtool menu. And when you pull this guy up, it has all your models here, similar to how if you have a bunch of objects in Cinema. And so here you can switch over between the models. I'm not going to be using the eyes, so I'm just going to go ahead and just deactivate it so you can kind of see it without its eyes. And you can just delete it if you want. I'm not going to do that right now. But yeah, it has all these other options down here, such as, like your usual thing, like you can create folders to store things in, duplicate, whatever. But these things underneath it, such as split, merge, Boolean, and also this one, extract, are going to be really important. But on top of that, you're also going to want to get familiar with some of these other ones, such as this one that says geometry. This one's really interesting because it allows you to do a lot of things with your topology. So one thing that I use a lot is here inside of the modify topology, I like to use this thing called close holes, which, closes, pretty self-explanatory, but it's really useful, especially when we start using this other tool. And also you got this one like the mirror and weld, which is really nice. So you can do one side work and then just hit that and it'll duplicate it. Even though ZBrush works in a like symmetry fashion, sometimes it's better to do one side and then just mirror it, simply because of how the gizmo for manipulating objects works. We'll get more into that a little bit later. You'll see what I mean. But the last thing I would say to get familiar with is this guy right here, the Z Remesher. The newest version of Cinema already has this built in, which is really nice for remeshing your models. It gives it a really nice topology. And so if you look over here, this guy already is made out of quads, but the process of sculpting ends up creating a lot of like triangles, and this thing really helps clean it up. It's also really good for creating low poly versions of your really detailed models, which is something that we're going to do. And so just hold on to that thought. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and get started into sculpting. And the first thing I want to do is create the base for the JSON mask. And the way to do that, what I like to do is actually use the extract method. So if we go back to our subtool and come down to extract, I can show you what it does. So holding down control, you can then click and start dragging, and you start making this mask. So let's go ahead and just kind of like cover up his face and just do that. And so now his face is completely masked out. And so if you go here to your extract, you can see that it basically like extrudes out everything that I selected. It's almost like selecting polygons and then using the extrude function inside of Cinema. But if you notice, it also extrudes the eyes, the nose, the mouth. And so it creates a ton of geometry that I don't want to deal with. But also on top of that, so let me pull this guy up. And so if you notice, there's this button right here that says double. So I'm going to go ahead and hit extract and then accept, which then turns it into actual geometry and gives me a subtool, which you can see here, which is called an extract. So if I deactivate the head and it shows me the mask, you can kind of see all the weirdness that it creates, like the eyes, the nose, and also the mouth. But also, if you notice, this thing is a little thick right here. So if I turn on the head again, kind of move it, and I turn it on and off, you can see that it's almost like it's carving into the face. And I don't want that to happen. I want it to be like coming from the face out. So let's go ahead and go back to our demo head. I'm going to turn off the new extract, and I'm going to create a new one. But this time I'm going to deactivate double. And then I'm just going to hit extract and accept one more time. And let's go ahead and turn this guy off. And you can see it's a little thinner, and it's laying exactly on the top of the face. And so that's useful to me, and also gives me a better idea of how it's going to lay on this character's face. Cool. So let's actually undo all this, because we quite honestly do not need all this. So let's go ahead and get rid of these new extracts. Let's go back to our character here. And instead of masking out a face and then extracting it, let's make some modifications to his face itself. So let's go ahead and clear the mask by holding Control and then dragging and letting go. And here is where I need to talk about Sculptris Pro. Sculptris Pro is this really interesting part of ZBrush which allows topology to be created where you use your brush. But you're going to notice something right away when you try using it on this guy. So I'm going to go ahead and activate it. And so you just press this button up here, and then you drag across. And so now we get all of this text over here saying that this thing is composed of subdivision levels. And if you're familiar with subdivision surface inside of Cinema 4D, same thing. Except that it's not controlled by a generator or anything that you put underneath a thing. It's really just controlled within these menus. And the way to adjust your subdivision is to go over here to your geometry tab and go over here to where it has your low res and then subdivision levels, and then also the ability to delete and freeze. So right now it's currently set to a subdivision level of 3. So if we bring this guy all the way down to 1, you can see what its base shape looks like. If you turn this on, you can see the polygons, very low poly, and that's great. I'm going to go with that because I don't really need it to be hyper detailed. I'm going to add all that stuff later. So what I'm going to do is just go ahead and just delete higher, and now it's completely got rid of all subdivision. It's almost like I turned off the subdivision generator. And now what I'm going to do is activate Sculptris again. And now when I drag across, you can see that it's starting to do something to the topology, which is turning all these quads into like these triangles or even just smaller quads. And what's great about this is that it isolates all of the detail into where your brush is going. And so sometimes before, you used to have to use like dividing and then just keep dividing. And eventually it just gets, it creates a lot of polygons. And there's certain areas that don't have detail, that don't have quite as much detail as like the face or something like that, but they still carry all these polygons. And so this is a great way to kind of just isolate all that detail into a single area rather than having it just be all over the place. So let's go ahead and undo that so that we don't have all those extra polygons. And what I'm going to do with Sculptris activated, it also has this really cool function, which when you do, when you hold down Shift to smooth it out, which I should have mentioned earlier, what it does here is that it also removes polygons, but it also kind of flattens it. And so it gets rid of cavities really nicely. And so if I want to like just flatten out his eyeballs and also flatten out his mouth, I can do that. And so now he has basically featureless. However, there is an issue with this guy, because if you notice, there's a hole underneath it in his nostril. So if I hold down shift and I start going, it starts deleting all those polygons. And so that's a little annoying. So what I'm going to do, just undo the whole thing. Let's kind of shift it over here so we can see the nose. You can see inside of it. And over here in your geometry, and go over here to modify topology. I'm going to bring it up a little bit so you guys can see what I'm clicking. Here in close holes, I'm going to press it, and then it creates these caps where the hole would be. And you can actually see it underneath it as well. It used to not have that, but then when I hit close holes, it actually adds geometry there. And so now when I use my Sculptris and smooth it out, I can then flatten it out, and now he looks a little bit like Voldemort. But yeah, so now I can pretty much turn him into a featureless face, and this will give me a pretty nice base to work from with that extract. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off this polyline fill, and what I'm just going to do now is just basically mask out the same area I did last time. And do that. Cool. And let's go back to our subtool and down to extract. So I have double turned off, and I can hit extract, which will then give me this nice shape taken from the mask. You can also modify it by increasing the thickness. I'm not going to play around with it too much because I like the size, but if you want it to be thicker, you can do it there. Let's go ahead and hit accept, and now we got ourselves our base mesh, essentially. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the head and just focus on this particular mask. And you see there's nothing weird going on in the back. The eyeballs aren't like, extruded. The mouth isn't extruded. It's just literally a thing that goes over a face. It's almost like a death mask, if you will. Let's go ahead and remove the mask. And now what we can do is start like smoothing this guy out. So you can use your like standard brush to kind of like fill in some of these cavities and add a little bit of volume, and then use your smooth to kind of like smooth it out. So I have a pure ref board already set up, which has all of the nice little references, and obviously you probably would want more, but later on when we get to detailing, I kind of want to recreate some of these like scratches and whatnot. This is good for reference for when we paint it inside a substance. Here's like a good, just like a shot from the movie, just so you can kind of see how it fits on them. I think it looks a little too big, kind of goofy, so I'm not going to adhere completely to that. But the reason I have these ones, these straight on shots, is for a couple of reasons. So that I have the correct proportions of the head, but also so that I know where to put these holes, including the eyeballs. So here's a funny little trick that I like to do. It's a little bit more, you can do it a little bit more elaborate. You can actually load the image directly into ZBrush and have it as like a background. But for me, I kind of like working fast, I guess, and not having to deal with more menus than I need to. So I'll kind of like zoom it in around here, and I'll switch back to ZBrush. And then over here, there's this little button that says see-through. And if I increase it, it lets me see through ZBrush, and I can still modify things. And so I can try to match the perspective. And then using my move tool, so if I hit V and V, make it really big, it allows me to kind of work through the image, and so I can kind of match the proportion correctly. So let's go ahead and just push the stuff in. Kind of gives me a nice general shape to match, but also it serves as an important function that lets me know where the eyeball, where the holes are going to be. Cool. So you can kind of see that it matches for the most part. Like it still requires a little bit of detailing. So let's go ahead and turn this guy from 37% down to 0. And let's go ahead and kind of fill in some of these like gaps, because you can kind of see like the cheekbones. So the tool that I would recommend here is using the H polish. So you just type in H, and then you can see the P as polish. Let's go ahead and bring this guy down, and we can start like flattening it out. And what's great about the H polish, it works really well with hard surface. And so, yeah, if you want to kind of create like a nice sort of sharp, like an unnaturally smooth surface, this is a great way to do it. It kind of gives you nice little angles. It's very, very popular with people who do like sci-fi, you know, guns and like armor and stuff. In this particular case, we're kind of just using it to, you know, flatten this guy out, make it look a little bit more like an actual hockey mask. Also, if you use your Alt button while using it, it actually does like the opposite, where it pulls out and flattens it, which is pretty sweet. So let's go ahead and just kind of do that. All right, so we kind of more or less have our basic shape. We can go in there a little bit more, but let's go ahead and see through again. Let's line it up. And we're going to switch over to this tool called the Dem standard. So it's B, D, and then S for standard. And here you can actually just go ahead and draw like little areas. And here you can kind of draw like little areas to let yourself know where you're going to want to put these holes, because we're going to use the Boolean tools to really drive this part. Cool. So you can kind of see maybe it needs a little bit more detail so that we don't get lost. Okay. And all right. Let's go ahead and turn that off. And so now we more or less know where we want to kind of poke our holes through. All right. So let's go ahead and create the eyeballs, which are pretty easy to make. So when you go into your brush and type in C, it'll give you the option to create these things called curves. All right, so let's start building out the tools that are going to poke through and create those holes. So let's go ahead and hit B, and then if you hit C, it'll give you access to all of the, they're called curve brushes. This one lets you create like a spline, which then gets extruded. So you'll want to find the one that says Curve Quad Fill. And so we can actually just go ahead and start drawing, as you can see. And then it creates like this extruded element. But if you notice, it's kind of low poly, and it kind of goes all over the place. So if you make your brush size smaller, which by the way, I don't think I mentioned, you can actually use the open and close brackets, similar to how you do in Photoshop, and then start drawing again. It actually gives you a much more refined shape. And so now when you look, it's pretty much just a flat object that's been extruded. And if you want to manipulate it, make it thicker, you can actually hit W, which then brings up your gizmo. And this one pretty much works like how the gizmo works in Cinema, except that instead of having to activate rotation, scale, and position one at a time, you can actually do all of them at once. So if you hit this little cube that's connected to the Z, you can actually extend it and it'll make it longer. Same thing with all the other ones. But the thing that I like in particular is this guy right here. This is called your screen space. And so if you notice, it's always facing the camera. So if you want to like move it just a little bit, it'll just move based on your screen space. I think it's really nice. It's really convenient. All right, so let's go ahead and line those guys up, and that'll be kind of like our first tool for poking through. Next, we need to create like tubes to poke through here. But first, we need to do one quick thing. But first, if you haven't noticed, what happens is that when you draw this thing, it basically creates another object that's part of the same tool. So we're going to want to split these off into separate tools. But if you notice, when you turn on your polyline, one object is red and the other one's yellow, and those things are called polygroups. And the way polygroups work is that they are a nice way of identifying sets of polygons, and you can actually split things based on which group belongs to what. So here they're already separated for us, so we don't really have to worry too much about that. And we don't have to worry about splitting it just yet. So just know that that's something we're gonna do. Cool. So if you hit Q, it brings you back to your brush, and you can see we have a mask going. So if you clear it, now we're back to our normal ZBrush, and we can actually, if you use like your standard, you can actually brush on both of them, but that's not what we want to do. Let's go ahead and add this tubes that it's going to poke through here. And the way to do that is actually really fun. There's a brush called the IMM brush. And so if you just type in I, you can see that there's a lot of them actually. So you have army curves, basic, Boolean, body parts. The one that I'm looking for is this one that says primitives. And so it gives you primitive shapes. So I want to use like a cylinder, and I want to drag it out from here. And so then, yeah, let's kind of like play around with it. So basically it's like you're dragging out a shape or like a primitive onto it. And once you bring it out, you can actually switch back to your gizmo and actually start moving it around. And since it's mirrored, it'll kind of copy on the other side. But in this particular case, I don't think I want it mirrored. I want to just do it on one side, then I want to flip it and just kind of like duplicate it. I can illustrate why. So like if I want to make this guy smaller, if you notice, it scales inwards. And so I kind of want it to, I want to be able to control it without having to worry about the clone kind of doing its own thing. So let's go ahead and undo that. And the way to deactivate symmetry is by hitting X, which shuts it off. And so now you can see it's only making 1. So I'm going to go ahead and add it here. I'll switch over to my gizmo. And now since I'm only manipulating 1, I have a lot more freedom to kind of pull in, pull out, manipulate it. And I think that's a good shape right there, but I also kind of want it to be flush with the surface. Cool. So I'm going to go ahead and just do this really quickly, but if you hold down Control while you select one of these guys, it'll actually create a copy. And here you can go ahead and start placing these. And so you've got yourself a couple of these. And it's really important that these actually cut through. So make sure you push these in so that they are, in fact, going through the model. I'm going to just go ahead and do that. Cool. So let's go ahead and focus on the bottom. Cool. And let's go ahead and duplicate that. And one more. Okay. So let's go ahead and put one here. Let's make sure it's going through. There it is. And let's do one more over here. Okay. I don't want to worry too much about these other ones because this is more for like demonstration purposes. So now that we have these guys in here, we want to duplicate them as a mirror so that we can fill in the other side. Cool. So let's switch back to our brush by hitting Q. And so now we can remove it. And so even though they kind of look like the same color as the red, they are in fact two different polygroups. So now what I want to do, and this is where we'll want to split it. So if you hold down Control and Shift, it lets you select polygroups just by tapping one of these groups. So if I hit the mask, it basically hides everything except this polygroup. And if you notice, the back of it was its own polygroup, so that's all gone. And so it's only the front. So if you hit this one again, it'll then show everything else. So let's go ahead and click outside. It'll bring everything back. So what I want to do is isolate these tubes. So if I hit them once, they are now being selected. And if I go over here into our subtool and go down to split, I can choose this option here which says split hidden. And so it'll actually remove the connection between the two and actually give you a second set of a second subtool. And so now these guys are on their own, and if you can see, the mask is on its own as well. It still has the eyes, which is fine. We'll get to them in a little bit, but let's go ahead and fix this guy real fast. And let's go down to our geometry tab, and then over here in mirror and weld, you want to hit this guy, and it'll just it'll mirror it and basically make it part of the model. So I do want to talk about one thing. So if you ended up starting out on the right side and then doing it, and then start noticing that when you hit the mirror and weld, it disappears. I can't really replicate it for some reason, but if you are having that issue, go down here to deformation, which you can see right there. And then here in mirror, you can actually just hit that and it'll actually swap it to the other side. And then you can do the mirror and then you can do the mirror and weld on the other side. So that'll kind of help fix that, and you won't have to redo all the tubes and stuff. Cool. So now that we have those guys separated, let's go ahead and take care of these eye holes. So yeah, basically same thing. Go ahead and just tap it. It'll select the whole thing. And so now if you do the same thing, which is split hidden, it'll now separate the eye holes, as their own object. And here is where we're going to start using the Boolean tool. So let's go ahead and grab our mask, which is the base, which is called here extract 7 in mine. I'm going to pull it all the way up to the top, not quite all the way, but just above the tubes and also the eye holes. And what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to get rid of this menu up here. Cool. So now what we want to do is use this live Boolean tool. So right away, it doesn't really do anything because it's not really set up to do it. But basically the way it works is that the thing that you want getting cut up by other tools, you want to have at the top. And so everything that's going to be cutting into it or merging into it, whatever, should be below it. So, and the way to do Boolean is very similar to how you do it inside of Illustrator when you're using something like Pathfinder. You click on this little button here, which is kind of hard to see, but it's right next to the eyeball. And right now it has a union set up, but if you go to the middle one, it'll then set up for subtract. And you can kind of see right away that it pokes a hole through it. And now if we select our eyeball and we do the same, it now also, let's see if we can. So yeah, you can see that it's poking right through. And same thing here, you can see that those holes from the top are being poked. Cool. So that's more or less how you kind of create like the base sort of mesh. So if you want to turn this into into geometry, because if you notice, if I hit W and I start moving this around, it actually will, it's like procedural. And so, but you can't really start sculpting on it until you sort of like accept the changes. So the way to do that is by clicking on your model that is the topmost in that stack. And here inside of your subtool menu, go down here to Boolean, and it gives you literally one option, which is to turn it into a mesh. So let's go ahead and hit that. And so it creates it, and you're like, where is it? It's not in here. It actually creates a new tool in this like little menu thing. I'm not entirely sure what these things are. It's kind of like this thing, but a very small version of it kind of in your UI. So now you have access to this wonderful thing, which gives you all the holes. And now what we can do is by using our tools, I'm going to turn off Sculptris. We can actually start sculpting on it. And you can see that we start manipulating it. And here we can actually, if we switch over to move, we can actually make our final changes to it. Let's go ahead and turn on X so that we can have symmetry. And if we go through see-through, we can actually line this guy up again. And here we can kind of get the eyeball correct. Because if you notice, they're not quite perfect, which is fine. And then you can also smooth it out and get it as close as you want. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it does help if you're trying to make it as one-to-one as possible. Cool. So let's go ahead and turn this guy all the way down. And yeah, and from here we can start, you know, adding details and whatnot. I personally would recommend polishing it up and getting it looking nice first. But first thing I would do, honestly, is this thing looks really ugly. Like, it has a lot of messy geometry and stuff, and so I would like to give myself a nice starting point rather than this really messy thing. So if we go down to our geometry and go down to, let's turn off this modified topology and go here to Z-remesher, we can actually then Z-remesh this guy. And right away you can see that it creates this really nice mesh that has all of, like, has all the holes, and it has this really nice topology that actually is made out of quads essentially. And so here you don't even have to use this guy anymore, the Sculptris. You can pretty much just work on this like base mesh. And so if you just want to polish it up, you can, and it just makes it so much easier. Clean it up. And then if you want to give it a little bit more like of a hard surface, you can switch over to your H polish. And here you can start flattening stuff out and giving yourself like a nice base to work from. So I'm going to switch over to, so I can kind of give this guy a little bit more of a, like, just kind of make it look more like a mask that you would see like a hockey player. Cool. And if you find yourself kind of like struggling with that, getting the proportions right, it's probably a good idea to just go online and find a side view of a mask. It could either be the Jason mask or it could be whatever. And here you can kind of give yourself a nice little profile to work with, because, you know, you do have to put noses in here. Cool. All right. And let's go BMD. And here's a good time to kind of go in and do some modifications that you would want. Kind of want the eyes to be like a little bit bigger. Like, if you point them upwards, they look a little bit more sinister. If you put them downwards, they look sad. So like, kind of creating like that like nice little flare can look cool. One thing I found that I really enjoyed is that if I make this really big and then pull this guy down, actually let me make it even bigger, and then you kind of push it like inwards and down, it kind of creates like this nice sharp sort of thing. It kind of makes it look a little bit more like Casey from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Yeah. And so, yeah, you can kind of play around with it. It doesn't have to be perfect, you know, exact. But one thing that I will point out that is going to be kind of a little bit of a difficult situation is that if you notice, all of the poly groups that we had are pretty much gone. This thing did not preserve those poly groups. So if we go all the way back and look at this guy before it's switched over, you can see that there's a poly group here, there's a poly group on the back of it, and there's also polygroups on the inside. And so those are kind of important. Not really sure what's a good way to explain it, but it helps a lot with the UV unwrapping part of it. So let's see if we can do this while preserving it. So if we activate this keep groups and then run it again, let's see what happens. Cool. So now that we have all of these groups still preserved, we can then go through the process of cleaning it up, and this will make it a lot easier to UV unwrap it. Okay, so now that the Z-remesher has done its thing and it's also maintained these poly groups, it actually becomes really useful for when we're UV unwrapping it. So to UV unwrap something, we need to go over here to our Z plugin and go over here, bring this guy over and snap it over to the side. And then you can see that there's this guy right here called UV Master. Okay. So something that I want to point out here is when you UV unwrap it, it'll kind of just run an algorithm to try to get the best sort of cut on it. But because we have all these polygon groups, what we can do here is go to polygroups and activate it, and then hit unwrap, which you can see it kind of working right now. And so now what we can do is actually go into our flatten mode and actually see that it's been cut in a pretty all right way. It's a little weird on the sides and all this other stuff. But if you don't have those poly groups, sometimes the algorithm gets really weird, and actually it struggled a lot with that early on when I was first making that model. So it's a good idea to just make sure that ZBrush is able to UV unwrap it pretty easily. So yeah, the way to check it is over here on this flatten button. It'll just flatten it out, and then you can hit unflatten. You can also activate this check seams, which will kind of show you where the cuts are. It's like a little red line. You can't really notice it, but if I turn on and off, you can see that there's like this little line that appears around these circles and also around the edges. And if you notice, it's using these polygon, like using the groups as the way to where to cut it. So I just wanted to address that. This is nowhere near where I would take the model. I would go in here and do a lot more detailing and stuff. So just to kind of like save myself a little bit of time in the future, what I'm going to do is just go ahead and duplicate this guy. And just have myself a second copy, just one that has the UVs already set up, and maybe I can just like reuse them or something like that. But let's go ahead and just ignore all this stuff and keep working over on this side. So let's go ahead and get started with the detailing of it. I'm just going to add some like nice little scratches in here. Whenever you do the UV unwrapping, it actually applies this white texture to it. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over here, which is our materials, and I'm going to switch it over to something like this red. This one usually kind of makes it a little easier. And so here we can see the blob tool kind of running its thing, which is fine, but I want to do the alpha trick, which is bringing in our alpha, which will kind of give it a nice, like kind of makes it look a little bit more like it's being carved. And also I want to activate Sculptris. This way we can get a lot more detail in the model. Also, I don't want it to be symmetrical, so because it kind of creates these weird X's. So let's go ahead and hit X and turn off symmetry. And so now we can kind of go over it without having to worry too much. And as I mentioned before, you want to use Alt for when you're cutting in so that you can subtract from the volume. But if you don't want to keep holding Alt all the time, just go ahead and do the Z sub as I mentioned, and now by default it'll do that. But if you're noticing that it kind of creates like a low poly, almost like a blurry sort of cut, here's a way to adjust that. So here inside of your tool, up here in your stroke, you can actually go down here to Sculptris Pro. And here where it says subdivide size, it's set to 1, which is sort of like, that's like its default. It basically subdivides it by like a factor of 1. So if you were to do a 0.5, you can then see that it creates a lot more detail compared to where it was before. And obviously you can take that even lower. So if we were to bring this down to like, I don't know, 0.25, you would get a much more refined result, and it looks way nicer. Really impressive, actually. Cool. So let's go ahead and just start throwing some lines in here. So let's kind of like grab this guy, just cut right through. One thing I would recommend is try to add some randomness to your movement. Because I think humans tend to kind of work in patterns, and so sometimes you kind of just have to let your body kind of do its thing where it just works organically. So yeah, kind of just go in here, try to give yourself some nice like organic lines, go over them a few times, cut into it, and then if you hold it down for a while, it actually kind of does a really nice little effect, which kind of makes it go deeper. Cool. So yeah, use your pressure sensitivity to your advantage. And also, if you want to create like really messed up edges, you can definitely do that by just kind of running over it a few times. And also, if you alternate by holding Alt, it'll kind of bring it out. And so that's a great way to sort of create sort of deeper ridges. So if you keep running over that line right there. It kind of makes it look like it's, you know, it's been pulled out a little bit more. Maybe you can do like a melting effect. Cool. And so here we can kind of go ahead and damage this a little bit more. Oops. I keep hitting the this middle part, which is kind of causing it to fly off the hinges there. Let's go ahead and just add some. So I'm kind of just freestyling it. The reality is that I would spend, I don't know, probably like an hour or so just on this sort of like detailing pass, and constantly keep referring to these things to try to get some of these like nice looking effects. I could also do that same trick that I did before, where I switch back and then I go into this mode, and then I can try to like recreate some of the same cuts. So like right here, you have this guy right here. And then here you can kind of like maybe trace it, kind of give yourself some of these lines that you are seeing in the reference. So yeah, you can just kind of trace it a little bit if you want. Kind of gives you something to work from. But honestly, I think just sort of playing around with it and letting your hand kind of just run its course, it'll eventually give you a really nice result. There's this thing called emergent details, I think, or emerging complexity, I think that's what it's called. And that's from just doing a lot of small things that eventually stack up to make something look a lot more complex. So I'm just going to go ahead and switch over to the actual model that I used so that I can show you the finished product and also how I was able to re-topologize it and UV it. Okay, so this is the actual model I ended up making, and you can see this is actually the low poly version. No, actually this is the high poly version. So you can see all of the really intricate details that I ended up doing to it. You can see I went in here, start carving it up, adding all these holes in it. I really wanted to make it look like it got scratched by something like in this sort of general direction, but also wanted to kind of add some stuff to the eyes. I wanted to make it seem like it went through fire of some sort. But yeah, let's go ahead and turn on the polygons so we can see like what the topology looks like. And so after I ran it through ZBrush, this is the mesh that I ended up getting. And as you can see, it doesn't have the polygroups and all that stuff. So it actually made the UV unwrapping bit a lot harder on myself. So doing the normal UV unwrap was not quite as effective as I would like it to. So I actually took it into Cinema and did some modifications to it. So let's actually go into Cinema 4D. I want to actually show you guys what I did with the UVs and why I did the way I did, because it really helps out later on, especially when you're working inside of Substance, and also finally when you're working with the render engine, either Redshift or even stuff like Unreal. Okay, so here is the final product. As you can see, it's basically just a camera move on the low poly version of the model. So if you want to see, we can turn on our lines and you can see that it's the low poly version. It's not hyper dense or anything like that. And yeah, basically it just, I set up this nice little motion camera using a bunch of different cameras to merge into, and then finally came out with this guy right here. But let's go ahead and switch over to our UV layout so we can see what I did with the UVs on this particular model. So when we click on here, you can see that it's pretty much split up. I pretty much used the built-in algorithm of Cinema 4D to unwrap it. I wasn't super satisfied with what ZBrush came out, although what I showed you guys using the polygroups is actually what I should have done in the first place, but this one, I kind of had to learn the hard way on that one. So when you look over here, you're probably wondering to yourself, like, why did I lay out my UVs next to each other like that in 3 different blocks? And if you're familiar with UDIMs, this is more or less what I'm doing. To my knowledge, Cinema 4D doesn't have a UDIM system, but you can still work within like the system inside of Cinema 4D and it still work with UDIMs. So what I basically did was, once I UV unwrapped everything, I would grab the elements that I wanted. So like the front of the mask, I made sure to keep that in the first tile, which is kind of where everything starts from. And then having it moving over, I have the accessories, and then finally the inside of the mask. The way that I was able to kind of figure this thing out is using the transform tool. There's a little tab right here. And so whenever I selected these guys, I could literally just tell it to move one space over, and then it would like literally just move it exactly one space. And so I started doing that with all of the different elements. And so eventually, at first they were all on the first one, but then as I started splitting them out, I started giving them their own tile. And once you save this guy out as an OBJ or FBX and then send it over to Substance, something really interesting happens is that Substance recognizes it as a UDIM. And so now you're able to render out your textures using this UDIM system, and Redshift and even stuff like Unreal recognizes UDIMs. And so you only have to build your material once, and basically all the UDIM tiles get automatically populated. It's actually really cool, and I'm really glad I stumbled into this system. I don't know if that's intentional on behalf of Maxon, but I just wanted to point out that if you're trying to get into UDIMs, there is a little option for you. You just have to be familiar with this transform tool. Cool. So now that you kind of have like a general idea of the layout, let's actually hop on over to Substance Painter so that I can show you how I painted it. So when you're done in ZBrush, you ideally will have two models. You'll want to have a low poly version, which I showed you earlier, which is the one that we had in Cinema 4D, and also a high poly version, the one that is pretty much the extremely detailed version inside of ZBrush. And usually what I do is I export them out as FBXs directly from ZBrush, especially if the UV unwrapping worked out really well. If it didn't work out very well, I'll send the low poly version over to Cinema and then make the adjustments and then bring that over here to Substance. But it's really important to still keep that high poly version because we're going to do something called baking your mesh maps. So if you notice here, this is our low poly version, and when you kind of like scroll across, it does not look nearly as good as like what we just ended up doing. Like we just spent all this time putting all these cool details, and this thing basically is like a smoothed over version of it. So we want to be able to bring back some of that detail. And so the way you do that is by going here to your mesh maps, bake mesh maps under your texture set settings, and then you pull it open. And I already have it set up here where it's my high poly. All you have to do is click on this little thing and select your high poly. And so you can do an output size up to 8K. And at first you'll want to definitely start out small, like maybe like a 1K, and kind of adjust some of these settings. Let me show you some of the settings that I do apply. So when it comes to like curvature, I like to increase the secondary rays like by a lot. Same thing when it comes to ambient occlusion. I also increase the secondary rays. This way I can get like as good of a result as possible. Normals, you can't really do much on these guys. Position, yeah, this one is really nice. Basically what it does is that it scans the top to the bottom and it creates like a gradient, which tells it where the top is and where the bottom is. Because if you look at the UVs, they're not necessarily oriented in the correct way as you would see them up front. Like you can see that the mask is kind of like twisted in different parts since it's all chopped up. And here in thickness, this one's really good for if you're doing like skin. It's really nice to be able to control like the scattering effect and stuff. So once you kind of have it all set up and ready to go, all you want to do is go here to bake, select the textures. And you'll notice that it does this really cool process where it kind of creates all these weird colors, like brings in the normal. And basically what it's doing is grabbing all the data from your high poly ZBrush one, and it's basically transferring it down into the low poly, but it's storing it as an image. And so instead of having a lot of polygons, what you're doing instead is you're putting all that data onto a 4K image. And the way Substance works is that it uses all of those images that are being generated right now, and it uses it to control these things called generators. And generators are probably the number one thing that I would go to Substance Painter for. It allows you to add really cool weathering effects, really just creepy things overall. It's really good for horror, especially since that's kind of where I operate. And so I'm going to show you a couple of my favorite ones and then show you what the final product looks like. So here in your layers, I like to create myself like either I drop in a single layer. I try to work in color source before I use any of these materials. If I want a specific sort of looking material, I'll kind of look down here to see if there's one that's similar to it that I can kind of derive some data from. But because I'm not really doing that right now, I just kind of want to give it a base color. I go in here, and when you create a fill layer, which I did by clicking this like bucket, what it does is that it gives you these options. Let me see if I can hide my head. There we go. And it gives you the option to change the color. It also gives you the option to mess around with the height. You can't really notice what's going on here because you kind of need it to combine it with other things. Roughness, basically makes it shiny or not shiny. Same thing with metallic, makes it metal looking or not metal looking. So you can kind of really see the difference between roughness, like no roughness, and all the roughness when you have your metallic slider up. Let's go ahead and adjust some of these settings here on our material. So you can actually deactivate each one individually, or if you hold down Alt, you can actually just activate the one while it deactivates the other ones. So if I go ahead and have them all active and I just want the color, I'm holding down Alt and I click, it wipes out the rest, and now it's just giving me color information. So in this particular case, I want to have a little bit kind of like a nice like white, maybe orangey color as its sort of base. Not too white, and if you want to color pick, you can actually go in here into your like pure ref, and here when you're clicking on the color, if you click on this guy and hold down the left click, you can actually drag it around and you can see that it's picking whatever color you're over. So here I'm actually putting it over the mask reference that I have, and here you can see that it gives you this nice like white color. So I'm going to kind of just desaturate it a little bit more and maybe bring down the brightness just a tiny bit. On top of that, I want to kind of add like a little bit of like, what would that be called? Grime, like things kind of coming down. So let's go ahead and create another fill layer. And again, Alt, click, and then select just a color. So here I'm going to go ahead and select this brownish black that I see over here on my reference. And what I'm going to do now is go over here to this button, which is where you create a mask. And so you have the option to do all these different masks. I'm only going to talk about these two, which is the black and white. And so white is basically just, all of it is visible. If it was black, it would be all invisible. So here, while clicking on the mask itself, so if you notice, you can actually switch between the two. On the mask, you can go here to this little like magic wand thing, and it gives you the ability to add all this other stuff. So I'm just going to add a generator, and by default, the generator is empty. So here, when you click on this guy, it gives you the option of all these different generators, which aren't a lot, but you can actually add more to them if you download them from like this Substance Share, I think it's called. But in this particular case, I just want to create like a nice dripping effect. And so this thing is called Dripping Rust. And it kind of looks rusty, I guess, but you can kind of control it. You can kind of bring down the contrast on the rust itself. You can also smooth it out, but then you also have this option here, which is drip intensity. And by playing around with it, you can kind of find something that works for you. And if you don't want to do like a rust, maybe it's looking a little bit too much like rust, you can clear it out and choose something else. So let's say we want to focus our details around like edges and stuff. If you select curvature, you'll notice that it focuses it around the sort of like the sharper sort of curves. And here you can kind of see what it does, where it's kind of coming from. So anything that's curved automatically gets preferential treatment. I'm pretty sure you can actually visualize it by going here So up here you can select your material and also see all the different channels. So you can look at your color, roughness. Like there isn't really any data in roughness, so it just appears as a grid. But if you go all the way down here to where it says mesh maps, you can actually look at like your normal map. And so you can kind of see all the details that were brought in from your ZBrush model. But on top of that, you can also look at your curvature. And so here you can see that all of the data is pretty much isolated to the areas where there's curves, small like cuts and stuff like that. Same thing with ambient occlusion. You can see that it's all inside of those cracks. And we don't really need to worry about thickness because it's not really going to be used, but you can kind of visualize it. So it's pretty interesting to kind of go through it and see what Substance is seeing when it takes data from it. So let's go ahead and go back and let's kind of play around with this a little bit more. And the thing that I've realized when it comes to working both in ZBrush and Substance is that subtle, small changes stacked on top of each other eventually produce a much more interesting result rather than having like really intense things on top of each other. And it's a lot about restraint in some ways and just allowing the sort of like organic nature of mixing different textures and different just like randomness working together to actually create something interesting. So here, like this could be like this is a perfectly serviceable sort of like base layer for like just creating some darkness around the eyes and also around like the cuts. And so we can then create yet another layer. And this time we're just gonna choose color again, but this one we're just gonna do like a straight up black, but not completely black, just a little bit black. And this one we'll go ahead and add a white mask, and again select the generator. And on this one we're gonna do dirt, and this one is gonna isolate it inside of the cracks. So here we can see that everything's inside, and by playing around with this you can see like just how it's kind of coming out. And this is a great way to introduce dirt, which is what it's called, but it also kind of gives it a nice like weathering effect. You can also play around with the grunge amount. So if you want things to kind of be coming out more, you can also pull back the dirt, but increase the grunge amount. So there's more like little specks here and there. And that's a pretty solid like second layer. But again, it's a little too intense. It's like almost completely black. So you have a few options. You can either, just brighten the sky up a little bit, and you can see it working in real time, which is awesome. But here's another thing that I found really cool. In the same way that Substance is pretty similar to Photoshop, it's like Photoshop for 3D models. This thing also has transfer modes. So if you notice, there's this little tab here which lets you select your different channels. Since we're only working in color currently, it now just has all these options for the color. And so we're set to normal, which is basically just the black and white. It appears as it wouldn't appear normally. But if you were to do like a multiply, it'll start adding all that different math to it to kind of create different transfer modes and different effects. And so something I like to do is hover over just the blending mode, and then using the spin wheel on my mouse, I just like to go down and I just look at what happens when I do this stuff. And if there's something that maybe interests me, I'll kind of explore it a little bit more and see what happens if I change the color to it. Like maybe if I introduce more red, or if I desaturate it, like what does that do? And then I cycle through these again and see if that did anything. Like now it looks a little bit more red than it used to, And there's some pretty cool stuff that you can do with that. I think just kind of stacking them on top of each other is really cool. So if I were to duplicate this layer and then maybe play around with the dirt. So let's go ahead and click on the dirt, and let's see the grunge amount. Let's bring it down a little bit, or maybe just bring it up higher. And the dirt level, maybe we could bring it down a little bit. And this guy, we're going to make it a different color just to make it easier on us so we can see which one is different. And so you can see it's affecting a much larger area, but as you kind of go in here, you can then see like how it plays with the lower level. So like this looks kind of cool. This is like it's burning it. So let's go ahead and just like saturate it a little bit, see what happens. Even just playing around with like the colors. So let's see. I think just darkening it up, removing some of the saturation. And also on top of that, I also like to remove some of the opacity. And that way I can stack even more layers on top of them. So there's another thing I do want to show you, which I think is pretty cool. I'll do it again with another layer on top. This one I'm going to make it a much more garish color just so that we can see it, maybe like a blue or something like that. I'm going to go ahead and deactivate everything again. And over here in our mask, I'm just going to choose a black mask, which makes it completely invisible. But now I'm going to use this really cool feature that Substance has, which is they're called particle brushes. And the thing that's awesome about particle brushes is that it uses like a simulation to kind of create the effect. So if I were to select this organic spread and I just were to like go in there, it creates this really awesome spread of particles. Same thing with like the liquid stream. It just falls down and it creates like these really cool like splatter effects. And then if you do a fire, it'll kind of like go upwards. It creates a nice little effect. So with that being said I wanted to do like a little bit of like if it's raining on top of it, there's this really cool option called rain. And so if you just hold it over, it'll then just start accumulating rain on top of it, and it'll start revealing more of the mask. And so now you're starting to get a little bit better like results, starting to look a little bit more, like organic. And it has much more realistic weathering effects. But if you're noticing, it kind of has this weird sort of movement to it, where it looks like it's going this way and this one's going down to the side, and same thing here. And that's because it's using kind of like the normals, or basically the orientation of the UVs to kind of drive the direction. And the reason for that is because it has this thing here called the normal factor. And the normal factor is it looks at the normals on your model itself, and then it'll kind of tell it affects gravity in certain ways. So let's go ahead and undo that, and let's also take off this normal factor. And let's go ahead and run it one more time. And so now you'll notice that it's spreading a little bit more realistically. It's just going straight down. It's not really using the normals in any way to sort of divert it going from one way or the other. And so, yeah, you can give yourself like a really nice looking effect. And then if that's not good enough for you, you can also then grab stuff like the splat tool. And so then that then creates like nice little runny sort of things of liquid. Again, this one also kind of does that thing where it kind of moves direction. So if you remove here this normal factor and then just kind of draw, it'll fall down a little bit more realistically. So if you have really weird UVs where they're all like just twisted all over the place, it's the normal factor. So cool. All right, so let's go ahead and look at the final product so you can see how it came out after I had done all of this with multiple layers to all of the different elements, such as adding metal to the little latches, and also kind of treating those little triangles as their own thing. So let's go ahead and switch on over to that. Cool. And here we are with our final asset, and you can see that it has a lot of layering, a lot of weathering effect. You can let's see what's a very obvious one. Let's see. Oh, and sometimes it doesn't immediately react. But yeah, so this one kind of just has like splotches of like grime. And let's see what this one does. This one kind of affects the metal alone. And so here you can see its final product. I think it looks pretty cool. It kind of gives it a nice little grime to it. And all you have to do now is export this guy. So just go over here to File, then Export Textures. And by default, it'll do something like, where is it called? It'll do something like this PBR metallic roughness. But I've actually went ahead and created my own templates. So I have Redshift, but I also have one for Unreal Engine. But we're going to be using Redshift. And over here, you can see what it's going to produce. And if you notice, it's going to produce 3 different sets of textures. And that's so that it can do like the first tile, second tile, and third tile. And each one has this 1001, 1002, and 1003. And it's referring to the tile sets that it's going to be using, or it's going to be applying it to. And then I just hit export. And let's go ahead and jump into Cinema 4D so you can see how UDIMs work. Okay, so we're back in Cinema 4D. I already have my camera set up. It's all nice and animated, looking cool. But let's go ahead and just sort of get like a nice angle so that we can start building up this shader. So let's go ahead and create a new redshift material. Let's give it a second. Okay. So now that we have our shader open, let's go ahead and pull in our textures. So if you notice, I have all of the textures here, and they all have the 1 and 0.1, whatever. So we just want to grab the 101 of each one. So it's a lot. It's a mouthful. And let's go ahead and drop them all over. And let's go ahead and apply this material to our JSON mask. And let's activate Redshift. Now go ahead and dock it over here and hit play. So if you notice, it is not really looking correct. Like there's supposed to be red on the on these little triangles and stuff. And if I rotate around it, you can kind of see that it's also really weird looking back here. So, and also, yeah, since we're doing a lot of the close-ups, you can see it kind of acting really strange. Okay, so how do we fix that? And it's a pretty simple way of doing it. Okay, so once you click on your texture right here, you'll notice that there's this 101. So you delete the 1001, and what you type in is you do this little caret thingy, and then you type in udim, and then you close it with another bracket thingy. Cool. So once you do that, Cinema 4D will then recognize it and will then start doing that for all of your materials. So now it is going to look at the 3 different sets. You also have to do these for these other ones, but I'm just going to do it for the color because if you notice, they kind of stuttered there for a bit. So now you can see that our red is appearing red, as it should. Cool. I went ahead and built one with all the UDIM set up correctly. So now when we go in here and we see it up close, you can see that there's all this nice little detail that was only present in the second tile, now being visible. And if I rotate around, you notice it looks correct. Cool. And so basically from this point on, all you have to do is now light it. Okay, so here's kind of like the final product. I didn't actually render it out of Cinema. I actually sent it over to Unreal Engine. The thing that I noticed is that when you work in ZBrush by doing the high poly, then the low poly with the UVs, and then doing the whole substance painting, is that it makes it cross-compatible with not just normal 3D programs, but also with like game engines. And I found that to be really cool. Because it allowed me to kind of hop between software and choose the application that worked best for me. So this animation is about, I don't know, I think 30 seconds. So something like that through Redshift and stuff, it would still take a good while, whereas Unreal was able to crank it out in real time. So I got it in 30 seconds back. I was actually able to render it out twice, one vertical for Instagram and one horizontal for like YouTube and stuff. So there's like some pretty interesting things that you can do with it. UVs are kind of like the, what's a good way of describing that? But they're like the key, the linchpin to making it work on all software. Because if you're just working on procedural materials and stuff like that, you're not going to be able to quite leverage that over in Unreal. You can in Cinema, which is one of its strong points. But yeah, I personally like the ability to be able to go on multiple software.
And there you have it, my start to finish process on how to make high quality 3D models. I know that when I first opened ZBrush, I remember screaming in confusion, but having learned these like simple tips and tricks has really allowed me to dive deep into the software and actually explore it much more thoroughly and actually create better art because of that. All right, well, that wraps it up. Thank you so much for sticking around and checking out my presentation. I really do appreciate it. I've been Luis Miranda. Thank you.